Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new Sit Down Quilting Sunday video. I have basted up several wonky Christmas tree quilts and I can't wait to start quilting. But I want to do something kind of different with these quilts. I really want to bling them up with some special threads and add some glitter and sparkle to the surface. But in order to do that, I've got to test out those new threads and see how they're going to work on the Grace Qnique. So today I'm going to grab a practice sandwich and experiment, just simply learning how all of these different threads work and keeping some notes so that way I know what I need to change the tension to, what I need to keep in mind as I switch to different threads. Now, some of the threads I'm going to be using, Superior Threads Magnifico, Superior Threads So Fine, some Aurifil threads, and Ricky Tim's Razzle Dazzle thread. I'll be using that in the bobbin. So if you'd like to join in the fun and test out some threads too, check out and see what you've got in your stash already. And if you've been afraid to use it on your machine, pull it out and give it a try on a practice sandwich. I promise it's not going to break your machine, but you're definitely going to learn a lot about using different threads and adjusting your tension depending on the weight. So let's get started. So the first thread I want to try out is Superior Threads Magnifico, and this is color 2164. It's this really light silver color, and I can just tell you from the feel of it, this thread feels thinner than Isacord. I think it's a polyester. Yeah, it's a 40 weight polyester, and the cone comes with 500 yards. So that's about as much as I know about this thread. I've already wound a bobbin with this thread and it's in place. Now I'm going to thread the top of the machine and we'll get ready to go. So this is a thread test. I might not even bother putting on gloves because I am just out to test the threads, take a look at them. So I'm going to be doing really short stitches, breaking thread and then flipping it over to take a look at it. So that's about as much as I need to stitch. I've right now just set my tension to be the lowest setting on the top. I don't usually adjust my bobbin tension, but now I just want to take a look at the stitches and see what I can see. What I'm seeing here on the top, this is the right side, and I'm seeing subtle dots in between the stitches. That's telling me if I'm seeing dots of the bobbin thread being pulled to the top, then that's telling me the top tension might be a little tight. Well, I've already got it at the loosest setting, so there might not be much I can do about that. On the back, this thread looks great. Nice delineation between each stitch. You can really see that beautiful thin thread on the surface of the quilt. So I kind of like it from the back so far. Let's see if we can get the front looking just as good. So I've done a bit more stitching, and another thing that I like to look for is little bubbles and kind of like a little glob of thread that would form on these points. And that happens if you have a tension issue and the thread is just kind of gumming up right at those points. And so far I'm not seeing that at all. So I've already made myself a note here, the name of the thread, and then what I did to get the tension correct. So I loosened the tension completely on the top, and then I tightened it only by one number. And keeping that little note is going to make it possible for me to be able to switch to this thread now and immediately go back to this exact same setting and be able to produce nice looking stitches. Now, looking at the stitches themselves, I was mentioning the delineation, kind of the spacing between each stitch, and I am getting kind of a little tiny dot of the bobbin thread pulling up between each stitch. I gotta say, that's a level of nitpicky that I bring to the table, and it's not for everyone, and certainly this looks good enough. I would accept this. I'd put this on any quilt. The back, with this thread at least, is going to look better than the front. So that's something that I'm going to kind of keep a note of. I might even write that on my practice sandwich, that the back looks better than the front. And that could be, if I adjusted my bobbin tension on the bobbin case, it might adjust and get the two completely perfect. So it's always a ratio, it's always an adjustment. Let's change to some Aurifil thread and play with that next. So my next thread is Aurifil. This is their Lana wool. It is a 12 weight, and this is the first time I have ever used this on my machine. It is really thick and it's kind of fluffy. You can kind of feel, that woolly texture, and that's really cool. Now for this situation, because I had two different colors of thread, I had some orange and some red, I've got orange in the top and red in the bobbin. Now if I'm actually quilting a real quilt, I would use the same color thread in the top and bobbin. But when I'm testing thread, definitely makes sense to use two different colors, and that way I can see tension issues, problems with the stitches much more clearly. So I'm just going to start with my nice straight line. Might want to speed up a little bit so I'm not making huge stitches here. Stitch back and then stitch forward. You can see just how chunky that looks. That's a really heavyweight thread. I think it looks really cool. So now let me rotate it around. Let's flip it up. Oh, we got some problems here, as you can see. Let's see. Just taking a look at that, it's striking me that the top tension's way too loose. I'm seeing that top thread pulling down to the back really clearly. I'm also having a lot of, this was almost kind of, something was going wrong. Maybe the thread was pulling up weird onto the back. So let's see if we can adjust this away. I'm going to crank down on my tension dial and really significantly increase the tension on the top. And let's do some more stitching. Another thing I was thinking about, and I did not change this, but another thing I was thinking about was the needle. And I just broke thread, so I think I probably need to change my needle too. Flipping this over, you can see we substantially improved the stitches whenever we added, I increased the tension there. So I really improved it just in adjusting the tension, but I think if I go to a bigger needle, it'll be even better. So let's give that a try. So reset, got a bigger needle in. Now let's give this a try again. I'm going to go into some very simple stippling with a focus on some nice straightaways, and I broke thread again. You know, it might be that it's too weak and it's not going to be a good choice for long arming. It could be I still need a bigger needle, but you know, it might be boring to watch me continue to break thread multiple times. This is looking better as far as tension goes. The dots are much more minimal, and I think it just requires more playing. I need to continue to try out different needles until I find a big enough needle and the right tension setting so that the thread doesn't break. It could also work for bobbin thread work where I put a different thread in the top, and this is the effect that I'm getting from the back. We're going to be learning about that in just a bit. So for now, I think I'm going to put this Lana thread away and move on to a different Aurifil thread, the 20, let's see here, this is actually a 40 weight cotton thread. So let's try this next. So I've threaded up that 40 weight Aurifil, and again I have two different colors. I've got yellow and green. This is just to check tension, make sure the thread's going to be looking good. And I should say I did continue to play around with that Lana wool, and no matter how I adjusted it, and I even tried a couple other types of needles, it just kept breaking. So I think that's one of those things. I think that that thread would work better for bobbin thread work. So let's take a look at what this 40 weight thread looks like on the front and the back. This is looking pretty good. I might be able to tighten up the top tension very slightly, like maybe a half turn, and that's going to make those stitches look just even a little bit better. Oops, and I just broke thread. So I'm not sure if that thread break was caused because I tightened up the tension or because of the angle I was suddenly stitching at. So I'm going to give it a try and not change anything on the machine and just do some straight line stitching. Sometimes changing the tension could be enough to cause a thread break, and you know, it just suddenly puts a little bit more tension on the thread. So let's just see. And now I think I'll go into stippling. That looked like a little bit of a skip there. Yeah, I might be getting an occasional skip stitch every once in a while. Yep, there's one right there. That's something I definitely look for. Ooh, I got a big one right there. It's something I look for because I find it very annoying. Basically, a skip stitch is when you're stitching and the bobbin and the top thread don't connect together very well. This is not something that I struggle with usually with Aurifil thread, but then again, this is a long arm, it could be something to do with that. And there I just broke again. So I don't know. I'm not having obviously very good luck with the Aurifil. My spools are fairly old though. I think that these spools have been sitting around my house for going on 2 years. So it could be that, and length of time plus moisture, and my house is kind of humid. So that could have been what has weakened this thread. So don't write this off completely. I do think that Aurifil is a beautiful thread to quilt with as well. So now let's switch back to superior threads. I want to try some of this really thin So Fine thread next. So a little bit about this. This is a 50 weight thread, so it'll be the thinnest that we've tried so far. And it's polyester. The color I'm playing with is 401. It's just a solid white. And just looking at it, very, very thin. I mean, this is at least half the thickness of Isacord, the thread that I usually use. So I'm really intrigued to see what this looks like. This is going to create a really subtle effect on your quilt because the thread is so thin. Let's see how it works. So switch to So Fine, and I've loosened up my tension. And now I'm just doing my normal straight stitch and stitch back. Let's take a look. And I'm not seeing any spacing between these stitches, and if I look really closely, I'm seeing little dots of thread pulling up to the back. So it's almost like the bobbin thread is just laying on the surface and the top thread is looping over it, so it's not really pulling it into the quilt. So that means I need to tighten my top tension. So I'm going to tighten it, kind of crank down on it, maybe 3 rotations there, and let's see if that improves that stitching. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing, straight down, straight back. And I'm going to try and keep the same size of stitches too, although that just really depends on how fast my hands and foot are moving on the machine. Let's just see. That looks a little bit better. I'm still not seeing a really good delineation between the stitches. I'm not seeing that little bit of space between the stitches, so I'm going to crank down on the tension just a little bit more. And do that again. It's kind of just wash and repeat. Keep trying. Keep doing the same thing. Thankfully, haven't had a thread break yet, which is really nice. It's really frustrating when you get a hold of a thread and it just doesn't seem to want to stitch through your machine. And I hate that, I really wanted the Aurifil threads to work too. So here we go. This is looking a little bit better, but I think I could still stand to increase that tension up just a little bit more. There we go. Let's give it another try. And I'll probably stitch down here at another angle. That way I have a lot more space to see the stitching. Also understand that the angle you're stitching in can also affect the tension. So here stitching to the left and right might also look different from stitching forward and back. Even though it's a long arm, I have noticed subtle differences in the tension depending on the direction that I'm stitching in. So here, let's flip it up and take a look. Yep, I have great looking stitches when I was stitching to the right through here, but when I swung around and started stitching back the opposite way, the tension seemed to fluctuate and we got that effect where the thread was setting on the surface again through here. This might be a situation that I can't adjust away. I'm going to try and go up by another half a turn and see if that deals with it. But, another thing to keep in mind is most designs don't involve long straightaways. Most designs are stitch in a direction for a short period of time and then stitch in another direction. So that, unless you are stitching straight lines across your quilt, most likely that's not going to be a noticeable issue. And you could also break thread and always stitch the lines in the same direction too. Well, that stippling is looking pretty good when I flipped it over. Now let's check for some hesitation knots, those little globs of thread that can happen when you form points. I'm just going to stitch back and forth and add some flames here. And my stitches start getting big. That's mostly just my hands moving fast. I just need to put my foot down just a little bit and the machine will speed up. Oop, and that's where probably my limit of speed is. I broke thread probably because I was going so fast. So yeah, it's good to know what you can do with the thread. Really put it through its paces until you get a stitch issue like that, until it breaks. back looks just as good as the front. I think that that's a pretty good setting, but I will make note that it did break whenever I stitched fast. So all of that's good information. I'm going to write it down right here on the edge of the quilt so that way I don't forget what my tension is set at, you know, that I had a break whenever I was stitching fast, and that also it could have some directional issues depending on the lines that I'm stitching and the direction and angle I'm stitching. So now that I've run through all of those tests, now I want to try something really funky. This is Razzle Dazzle. It's Ricky Tim's special thread. It is super, super thick. So it's 100% polyester, and basically this is designed specifically for bobbin work and for couching and that kind of, or you could even do it with hand stitching. I've done some hand embroidery with this stuff. It's awesome, and I love that glittery effect. So what I'm going to do is wind a bobbin with it, only a bobbin, and then find a similar colored thread that will go on top. So I've wound Razzle Dazzle in the bobbin, and I've got Magnifico back in the top, and I'm just going to stitch a nice long straight line. I want these stitches to be relatively even, about the same size, so that way I can get a good idea of what's going on the back. So that's enough stitching, and now we're going to flip it over. So if I was adding this to a real quilt, I would flip the quilt over and stitch from the back. So I would be quilting it with the back side up and not able to see this thread as it's going on. So it's good to test it several times to make sure it's looking good before you stitch it on your real quilt. So this is looking okay. The Magnifico is that silver color, so it kind of blends in with the Razzle Dazzle, but I feel like if we tightened up the top tension, it would hold it more firmly to the back of the quilt. It would hang on to it a little bit better. So let's try that. I'm going to crank down on that tension just a bit, maybe rotate it 2 or 3 times, then drop the needle down and bring up that bobbin thread. And it is quite chunky, so you know, you're making a pretty big hole in the quilt by pulling it up, but it's much better to do it that way simply because it won't make a mess on your quilt. You want to be able to see those thread tails. Okay, so a little bit more stitching here, and we'll take a look at it. And bobbin thread work is definitely one where you can definitely get some globs of thread when you form points and stuff. It's just a matter of playing with it, playing with the tension, and then also picking designs that don't have a lot of sharp points so you don't get that issue. So here we go. That's looking a lot better, I think. It's holding it just ever so slightly firmer to the surface of the quilt, so it's just pulling it down. I could probably stand to crank this tension down just a little bit more, and you know, I'm probably never going to get a good delineation between the stitches because this is technically couching, but you know, the tighter and firmer that I can hold the thread to the surface of the quilt, the better. Now let's try some stippling and of course some sharp points. Of course, you're going to have thread breaks when it comes to using Razzle Dazzle. It's unavoidable. The best thing to do is just tie off and bury your thread tails the exact same way we do every other normal kind of quilting. It's a bigger knot, but you can absolutely tie it off and bury it just the exact same way. So that's a good bat of stippling. And the nice thing is the back of your quilt, you know, this would be quilted from the back. The back of your quilt's going to look good too. Let's see if I don't have enough distance here to flip that up for you. Let me stitch back. Get some distance here and we can flip this up and take a look. That's looking pretty cool. I love that effect. And you know, this will probably work really well for that Lana wool that we were using, that Aurifil thread that was thicker and slightly weaker. It would probably work for that too. Wind a bobbin with it, stick it in the bobbin case, and then get a similar color, or you know, you could play with multiple colors, really get funky stuff, funky combinations going, and I think that would look really cool too. So even if a thread seems too thick for to go through your needle, understand you've always got cool options and things that you can do putting it in your bobbin. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about using different cool threads on your machine. please don't be afraid of adjusting your tension dial. It's there for a reason, and it's not that hard to experiment and try new things. You really just need to bring patience to the whole thing. Go into it knowing that it's going to be off and it's going to look bad. And by playing and experimenting, you'll figure out what works. My number one tip is always use the same thread in the top of the machine as the bobbin, unless it's a really thick thread like the Razzle Dazzle. In that case, you only put it in the bobbin and you use a similar color thread in the top. So I really hope you learned a lot, and I can't wait to start quilting our wonky Christmas trees and using all of these beautiful threads on the surface. So definitely be joining me. The next several videos are going to be quilting wonky Christmas trees. I'm making these quilts for Christmas gifts, so you get to come along for the ride and see how I'm quilting all of them. So definitely be checking out and looking forward to new videos coming soon. Until next time, let's go quilt.